Welcome back, friends and chess players. Today we have an appointment with one of the most important themes in chess, how to attack. I'll show you 5 rules with 5 different examples, so 5 different types of attacks. Let's get started right away with this position, which many of you may have already recognized. This is an isolated pawn position coming from the Caro-Kann-Panov. In this position, to keep it brief, one of White's main ideas is to push this pawn to d5. Why is that? Because this pawn is an isolated pawn, it's a weak pawn, so White is interested in exchanging it, in getting rid of this pawn. And by doing this, he also opens up the way for his pieces. You can see how White is more developed, so by opening the lines, White's dynamism will be put to use. However, from this point of view, we need to follow the first rule. What is the first rule that many of us ignore? Exactly, you have to attack with all your pieces, and not just with a few. I can already see you trying to pull off the fool's mate and trying to attack with just 2 pieces. In chess, our pieces are like our team. They all have to work together toward the goal. And in this position, look, the rooks aren't participating, the bishop isn't participating, so we need to bring them into play. Because if I make, for example, this move here, which is the thematic move, Black can simply capture, a couple of exchanges happen, and in the end, White has gotten rid of the isolated pawn, but Black has no problems, develops their pieces, and White's dynamism has vanished. So, in this game, moreover, between 2 very strong grandmasters, rook to e1 is played. So White brings the rook into play and prepares for the future opening of the file. Black tries to develop their pieces, obviously with b6, and now queen to d3. The queen also comes into play, trying to attack on the squares and also to make room for the rook, which will inevitably go to d1. Bishop to b7. Now White plays bishop to a2, so he positions the bishop, not wanting to face moves like knight to a5 that would attack the bishop, so he preemptively repositions it. Maybe one day the bishop could even go to b1 to create this battery. Rook to e8 by Black. So White keeps developing his pieces, brings the bishop to f4 and the rook to d1. And only after White has activated all his pieces, he is finally ready. For the push d5, look what happens. After d5, knight takes d5, knight takes d5, bishop takes d5. And at this point, Black tries to free himself, as I mentioned earlier, with bishop to f6. And here, White's dynamism is expressed at its highest power, with a sacrifice. Bishop takes f7, king takes f7, and now queen to b3, check. The queen gives way to the rook, which will now go on to capture the queen. So you see, when all the pieces work together for an attack, how powerful that attack is. Now let's move on to the second theme. The second theme is the attack on a color. What is an attack on a color? We need to try to coordinate our pieces to attack a square, so of a certain color. In particular, here we already have a clue. Look, Black has the dark squared bishop. What does that mean? It means that not having the light squared bishop generally the light squares will be difficult to defend, so I need to direct my attack towards the light squares as is done in this game. Knight to g5. We start putting pressure on the f7 square. And what's more, we're also, look, putting pressure on the b7 square. So we're putting pressure on 2 white squares. So I go on to attack the white squares because I have dominance over the white squares. Now Black defends with knight to c5 and White renews the threat. Rook to c1 pins the knight and we threaten the pawn on c7 again. Black absolutely has to defend this pawn, so White continues with the attack on the color bishop to d5 again. We're attacking the white squares. At this point, Black tries to play b6, maybe to try to free the rook, and White continues. Queen to g4. Brings in another attacker, clearly aiming for queen to h4, and guess what color we're attacking? What are we attacking? Yes, we're attacking the white squares again. Now Black tries an emergency move with e6. But look at this beautiful sacrifice, which follows perfectly in line with the attack. On the color. Bishop takes e6, f takes e6, rook takes c5. This is a removal of the defender on e6. Pawn takes, queen first, rook takes, even though it's equivalent, rook takes, queen takes e6. And at this point, again, I'm attacking the light squares. The king can't go here because we would give this check on h7, so he has to go here. Queen takes g6, and White tries to checkmate on the light squares and actually succeeds. For example, if the black king tries to escape, we play queen, h7 check, and the final move, knight to e6, check, attacking again, again on a light square. And we manage to capture the queen. Do you see how throughout all this? In this example, black's bishop on g7 was always there in the middle, but it never joined the defense. Because we attacked the squares of the opposite color, since we launched the attack on the color. Now let's look at the third rule. The third rule, this one also seems obvious, but often it isn't. Quantity beats quality in an attack, obviously. So, for example, in this position, white has the queen, black doesn't, so this might seem like a problem, but black has two pieces and a rook to compensate for the queen. What's the problem? With a rook, bishop, and knight, I can attack you 3 times on a square that you, with just the queen, can only defend once. And for example, here, in a very, very simple way, I'm trying to give you simple examples because what matters to me is to convey certain concepts. Here, the move rook to c2 wins instantly, right? Why? Look, I attack this pawn on f2 twice and my quantity beats your quality because now if I capture, what can you do? You give me back the queen and then I end up with 2 knights against 1. And so here, white tried to escape. But look here, bishop takes f2, knight to e4, the number of black's pieces now attacking the white king, and obviously white. Even though he has the queen, which is the strongest piece in chess, he can't defend against the checkmate threat with just the queen. So now comes rook to c1, check, and obviously after bishop to g3, let's say, white resigns because rightly he would have to sacrifice the queen back, and now after knight takes there's a rook down in the endgame, so you see how quantity has completely dominated quality. So when it comes to pieces, in an attack quantity always wins, and let's look at the fourth example. The fourth example for the fourth rule, attack the weak square. In this case, the weak square, first we need to create it. This is a game by Carlsen, with Carlsen playing white and he risked losing. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, he actually lost. Because here, black goes on to create this weakness, creating it on g2. Take a look at this coincidence. Carlsen has the bishop here, the bishop on the dark squares. And so in some way, I attack on the light square, and then I continue the attack on the light square, entering the weaknesses of the position by attacking the rook. At this point, if we move the rook, look what happens. We're about to arrive and enter the weak squares. So here I'm going to attack exclusively the weak squares. I'm not really concerned about other things, like the pawn on c5 being undefended because I'm about to deliver checkmate. At this point, white should play this move. Why this move? Because after queen to h3, look at the threat. I want to move the knight anywhere, it doesn't matter where. Okay, except maybe to e3, otherwise I open up the second rank anywhere else. So h4, e1 or f4 to threaten queen to g2 checkmate. So at this point, white has to go back to d3. This way, they try to defend the square. f1, and now at this point comes a nice deflection sacrifice. e4, and obviously white can't recapture the pawn on e4 because otherwise the knight escapes and now there's no one left to defend against this mate. Basically, white has to sacrifice the queen, and so of course the game is lost. So white tries to defend with queen to f1, and at this point, in short, the game ends because of rook to f6, and there is no defense against the following rook to h6 and queen takes h2. So the fourth rule is to attack the opponent's weak squares. And now let's look at the fifth rule. The fifth rule is what I call the kill zone rule, meaning the war zone. We need to try to keep the opponent's king in the danger zone. For example, in this position, which comes from a rather particular variation of the London system, it's white's move. The current position on the board is completely equal. However, for white to actually keep it balanced, they are going to have to find and play a really complicated and precise move here. You see, white is down a pawn but has a nice pair of bishops. The king is stuck in the center, so all things considered, it seems that white has good compensation. So why not castle? Well, casting here is a mistake and immediately allows black to gain the advantage thanks to the move knight to e7. What does this move do? Besides offering the exchange of the pair of bishops, it also blocks the influence of this bishop. Now, for example, if I move the bishop to avoid the exchange, black can finally castle and has solved all his problems, and of course enjoys the extra pawn he had taken in the previous moves. So at this point, there is only one move that allows white to try to get counterplay in this position. The position is equal. It's not that white moves and wins, but white has only this move, which is really complicated to make, and that is bishop takes c6. White must voluntarily give up his bishop to ensure that black's king remains weak and in the center. And so in this position, there is counterplay, there is compensation for white. Then maybe he'll move the queen somewhere to try to attack the point. On g7, you see? See how black has trouble defending the g7 square, and above all, the king remains in the center. For example, now as white I can castle. Why can I castle? Because I've accomplished my mission of keeping the rook in the center, and so now I have compensation to be able to play with the rook. Weak, but as I told you at the beginning, a move like short castling is already absolutely disastrous, because if we castle after knight to e7, the king moves out of the kill zone, and we're definitely much worse off. So I hope that with these 5 rules, I've given you a small guide on how to attack. So, some elements to look for in positions where you are attacking. Of course, there will also be a video on defense coming next week. And as always, if you like these rules, let me know in the comments. Anyway, I'm looking forward to seeing you all. And if you want to support the channel, the usual hype, subscribe, like, and leave a comment, and I'll see you in the next videos.